Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm José.
And today we've seen Oppenheimer at the IMAX, so the second half of our Barbenheimer double bill. We're joined by my brother Stephen.
Hello.
We've seen it all together because we're down in London. That's where the BFI IMAX is. We've seen it on the film print. It's the only IMAX in the country that still projects on film. And it's the biggest screen in the country. And Stephen, as soon as the tickets came out, bought a bunch. So we've all got to go. So we have.
And it was amazing.
Yeah.
I think it was worth the effort of getting here to see it. It's a completely different, immersive and visual experience than you would get elsewhere. It's really worth the effort.
Yeah, so the story is about Robert Oppenheimer, who is infamous, as the guy who led the Manhattan Project, which led to the Trinity atomic bomb test in New Mexico, and subsequently the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that led to the end of Japanese involvement in World War II, shall we say, and sort of putting it a bit diplomatic. Yeah, surrender. There's obviously controversy over, was that a war crime? How guilty should America feel? That sort of thing. America has often held that it was the right thing to do. It was justified, but of course, no atomic bombs have been dropped in anger since. But the film is called Oppenheimer. It's about him. It's about his perspective, his history. It's part biopic. It's part courtroom drama, because after the bomb is dropped, questions are raised about his. Well, in fact, during the development of the bomb, questions are being raised about his communist past. Is he still a communist? His friends, things like that. These are all dramatized in the film in a series of narratives that cut back and forth on one another. People will be used to Christopher Nolan's non-linear narratives, although this is not as complex or it's nested as he sometimes gets. It's reasonably straightforward and quite easy to follow, but still that's what he's doing. So yeah, what did you think, Stephen?
I think the multiple strands thing is an interesting thing. I didn't find it especially easy to follow.
Okay.
I did have a hard time telling what happened before other things, but I don't think that bothered me particularly. Because there's a lot going on. You have him in his 20s. Mm-hmm. You have him during the war, during the Manhattan Project. Mm-hmm. Then there's a sequence of events not long after the war, somewhere in 47, 48, 49. And then there's what's happening in the 50s.
With the Robert Downey Jr. character.
But then the Robert Downey Jr. character is also there in the late 40s. I didn't mind the jumping around. There was a lot going on. To be honest, I don't really know. I wasn't quite keeping up with a lot of it.
I didn't have any problems with that at all. I felt I followed it well. I mean, I could be tested and be wrong, but kind of I didn't feel whilst watching it that there was something that I was missing. I thought that the film was so clever about putting forth story information that maybe only pays off later. So, for example, a simple thing, the introduction of Emily Blunt as his wife. You see her, and you see her in the background, and then lots of things happen before you return to her, before you realize that that's his wife. I mean, initially I thought, is Emily Blunt playing a secretary or something? You recognize her, but she's not announced. She is just background, right? So I think the film does that quite a bit, but I didn't find it any part of it difficult to follow. In a way, it's kind of quite chronological, in the sense that it begins with him as a student and, where he needs to go study to get the kinds of information that he needs. And then it's true that, characters are introduced, and initially you think, who are they? I felt that with Florence Pugh, the Florence Pugh character, but it doesn't take long before kind of you realize that it's like a passionate affair with a complicated woman and so on. I think the one thing that I minded about the film that you just made me think of, I hadn't really thought of it before, is that the film does assume that there was something wrong with being a communist in the 1930s, whereas in fact there wasn't, right? Kind of, it was a legal party, kind of people were doing legal things. I mean, it was like you had as much right to be in the Communist Party as you had to be a Republican or a Democrat, right? It only became a problem kind of, in the post-war period, a problem that was taken up nationally. There was something shameful or disgraceful or, traitorous about, being a communist. I mean, that was certainly not the case in the 1930s. And I think the film kind of assumes that there is something inherently wrong with it.
I think it feels like the film it's not present in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s when it's happening. You feel like it exists in retrospect. It feels like a film that is adapted from a biography. The way that people talk a lot of the time is it doesn't feel like it's particularly naturalistic in its dialogue.
Which it is, by the way. We should say it is adapted from a biography.
So it feels like you're seeing events played out. I don't even know how much it's dramatized a lot of the time. But it's got a sense of its own place in history. Like you say, you have this sense of, it's not even a 1950s sense of communism not being a good thing. It's everything takes place with a sense of somebody in the 21st century writing about it and then having people act it out. It doesn't feel like, I don't actually feel like I'm in the 40s the way that I could.
Do you think that sense of the film implicitly believing that communism is wrong and an evil is true? It's definitely true of the scenes later on that are set in the post-war period, looking back at the 30s and questioning people's involvement with the Communist Party or people associated with it. The scenes, though, that are set in the 30s, do you think those as well are implying there's something wrong with communism?
I do, because the film goes out of its way to tell you that Oppenheimer is supporting the Spanish Civil War, and that, the Communist Party is just the one that's helping you, that you have to channel money through because that's the way of helping them, right? So it is kind of already making excuses, for him right from the beginning, which I don't think, I think, another film, for example, might have praised, these people's humanity and courage and progressiveness and, I know
what you mean. A film that was more confident in maybe in its audience, or certainly in itself, would say, this is how people thought at the time, and we can represent that quite frankly, quite honestly. And then later, when communism becomes the big threat to America, we can then look back on it. But the thing is, communism in America still today, especially today, is such a boogeyman thing that just the mention of the words is going to rile up feelings in the audience that it may not be easy to divorce from. You know what I mean? Which I'm not saying it's not a problem with the film. I think it's something the film could do and just have more confidence in its audience.
I don't get me wrong. I don't see it as a problem in the film. Actually, I think this is for me, it's a film with very few problems. I was just trying to pick up from Stephen's point about the film not giving you the perspective of the characters in the moment that they're living in. That it does have like a perspective from our vantage point onto their past.
I agree.
Which is, because you could conceive of a film in which you're seeing the characters in the moment that they live in. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of something like Julia, the Fred Zinnemann film, with Vanessa Redgrave playing a communist who's helping Jews in Vienna escape. And you see all that fervor and idealism and so on, right? And you can understand why somebody might be a communist, and be proud of it, right? Whereas this film, I think, begins with the assumption that it's something somehow wrong, right?
It's also really seen through Oppenheimer's eyes as well. And, I don't know I haven't read any biographies of him. What I know of him largely comes from this film, really. I only knew about him before that he was a physicist who led Manhattan Project and a couple of the choice quotes he had. So it may be true that he hedged as much as we see him hedge at the time, against comment. Well, I'll donate to the Spanish loyalists, but I'll go through the Communist Party. I won't become a communist. It may well be very, very true. It feels like hedging, though, on the film's part, though, that it won't commit to a point of view.
No. I don't know if that's the case. I think one of the two major points, and it might be the major point that the film makes, is that it's about somebody who thinks for themselves. So he flirts with ideologies. So there are things, in the end, what he feels and thinks about things is primary. And sometimes it crosses over with things that Communist Party members think, or communist dogma, and sometimes it crosses over with what, quote unquote, the US thinks is worth doing. But it's really about somebody deciding for himself based on what he thinks is worth doing in his own sort of moral centre.
I agree, and that's why I think perhaps that flirt is the wrong term, right? Because he considers,
Mhm.
right? And I don't think to him, there's no contradiction between, not being a communist, but supporting the loyalist cause, yeah? Kind of, he's thought it through, and that's kind of, his decision, right? Whereas flirting kind of implies that, you're drawn or interested, but ultimately kind of, want to be either drawn in or reject. And I don't think there's any of that. It is about his thinking process, yeah, kind of what he thinks is right. So, and I like that very much. I think this beginning, to me at least, gives the wrong impression of my view of the film.
Yeah.
Because actually, I think it's a truly great film. Yeah, and I think, what I want to explore or argue with you is the ways in which it is or it isn't.
Right.
Yeah? I think it's a terrific film because it's a complex film. It's a morally complex film about maybe the great issue of our time, yeah, where, kind of the morality of killing non-combatants, right? And also the implications of that for a world order, right? And yet kind of, it becomes a story of a friendship or a rivalry. So, the story begins in different ways. First, it's a young scientist and how to learn something that doesn't exist, right? Then it becomes about the possibility of, building a nuclear bomb, that again is something that doesn't exist, and how that's managed, and how do you draw people in, and how do you manage people's differences and get them to contribute, and how it takes place. I mean, I think that is a fascinating story of its own. It's the one with Matt Damon, right? Then there is the story of him then being judged and found wanting for the politics, right? And then the story turns again and becomes about the rivalry between Strauss and Oppenheimer. And I think that's managed beautifully, really, because, it's not that you think that the film deviates or changes course, is that, as you get each bit, all the rest makes sense in the way it originally did and in a different way. And I think it's just kind of beautifully narrated, actually.
The genre adapts and changes organically, and it always makes sense. And I love the feeling you get, and the music going under for such a long time helps with this, that you're watching a huge montage. At very few points does the film go, here is a scene. We're going to start and end a scene. Things just move gradually, and you'll go into, it'll be like Oppenheimer talking about his past, and he'll be talking, well, that's how the film begins. He's talking about his youth and his studying physics, and there's essentially montage about it, but then a particular scene in the lab is extended. It lasts for a bit, and so like you haven't just started a scene with a hard cut. You've moved into it gradually, but then it turns into something else, and then it moves out and becomes something else a little bit later. And the film is constantly doing this. It's remarkable editing to make this all work so smoothly, and there's such a sense of pace to it. And people have really talked about 3 hours and 3 hours is too long. And these films often, the kind of prestige films these days often have extensive running times because that feels like it's a part of selling its own importance, something you deserve to devote 3 hours to. But this feels like there's very few moments where I got bored or felt there was a lull. One or two, but for the most part, it's got this incredible pace.
I want to talk a little bit about the editing, because as we were walking out of the screening room, and I thought this is a real only fans of this filmmaker would talk about this, because that was a discussion. Wasn't the editing fantastic? I couldn't fault one aspect of it. And I also realized there's this cut in the film. That moment where he goes to teach, but he's teaching something new and he has no students. There's only one student that shows up. And then it cuts and you have like 10 students, right? And to me, that kind of condenses, what's great about the editing. Because in a way, it's a cliche. It's something that's been used before. But it's also an absolutely economical way through the editing of saying, this course now exists. It's gaining in popularity. Yeah, he's gaining in influence, etc. And it's just from a cut, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of amazing. And the film is full of similar and perhaps even better examples of the way that the editing is used. I thought it was tremendous.
Yeah. And to the point where when that stops being what the film is doing, when it does go into a quote-unquote scene, that scene is important. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of the one where the test actually happens. That's where it's interesting. Actually, there's a line in the film which is easy to pass by, but I really noticed it, where they're beginning the Manhattan Project, and Matt Damon has got him on board to lead it, and he's talking about having 4 sites. I forget where they were, but they're across the US. And then he draws lines between them. He's always doing everything on a blackboard, and he draws lines between them, and where they cross, that's where Los Alamos is, and that's where these all connect. But he says it's a point in space and time, and there's no time involved there, right? It's a point in space. So why does he say time? Well, space-time is the great insight of Einstein, and Einstein appears in this, and so much of what quantum physics is based on derived from him. But it's not just that. It's that I think the point at which the bomb is tested is the point in time. That's where kind of original sin is condensed into that singularity. They talk about singularities as well, black holes, the point of greater and greater mass that light cannot escape from. That's what that becomes in the film. It's the point at which everything changes and he realizes what they've unleashed, the power of everything, which is a little bit of a cliche, but it's what everything has to be built around. It's what it's doing deliberately, I think. And that's when I realised what that line means. It's not just throwaway and it's not just glib. It's a point in space and time. In fact, the original sin thing goes to the apple at the start. That is his original sin in a way. I mean, what is an apple if not an indicator?
I think this is a film in which nothing is accidental. Yeah, everything is kind of thought through and kind of deployed and redeployed. So, I was very surprised to see, as the film unfolds, not only to see the story, but how it's peopled, right? Because, I think one of the things about Nolan is who he now can get to be in his films. And it's everybody. Like, this is an all-star film, with kind of, stars playing kind of little roles. Often, just I mean, we were talking earlier about Tony Goldwyn, right? I don't know, I think he gets 3 lines or something, right? Like, this huge television star, kind of willing to be here for these 3 lines and making a moment of it. So it's not stunt casting, like everybody is properly cast. Tom Conti as Einstein, to mention just one of many. So everybody's kind of like beautifully cast, but kind of you can get a cast like that for this film and also afford not to publicize it, right? Because until you see the film, you don't know that all these people who do have marquee value of their own are in it, right? So I think there are several things here. The reason why he can get a cast like that is because he can make a film like this. So did you see any faults with it, Stephen?
To be honest, I don't really know what to make of it. I think it's so big and there's so much going on that I have to kind of stop myself shifting too far into disliking it while I'm watching it, because there are things that are it's a Christopher Nolan film and he can be really on the nose at points. There are a lot of occasions in his films where I don't feel like things are dramatized. I think it's very illustrative. I think but that's one of those things that I don't want to rush to disliking it. I think it's worth taking seriously because I think I agree with you that nothing's there by accident. So that's a really hard question to answer. I think I'm kind of interested to talk about it to figure out what it is before I can actually think about whether I like it or not. I think there are times during it where I dislike it because I do feel like I actually want a scene here and I want to feel like you're generating stakes in call it a traditional way. By the time we got to, it felt to me like the only scene that was a scene, and probably because it's when the sound design and the music quietened down a lot, was when you have whoever it is in the room talking about which sites are we going to drop the bomb on in Japan. That felt like a scene from a film that wasn't really this film. And maybe because it didn't also cut to other time periods, it didn't feel like it was part of the longer montage. But also while that was playing out, I thought, this is from another movie, and I like this because it's settled for a second, but I do like that this is a movie that is just sort of tumbling over itself. I really like how it opened. I love jumping back and forth from him into those sort of abstract, like incredibly expensive IMAX versions of like a Stan Brakhage film, where it's giving you a sense of, we're going to jump to these images of light and movement to give you a sense of how he sees things in his head, how he conceptualizes them, and then you see how that all of it comes together, like you say, in the Trinity test, where it's 2 hours worth of theory and decades of life in theory comes to this concrete point.
In a way that I found very moving, right? Because it's meant to be a moment of triumph, but it's also imbued with sadness. It brought tears to my eyes, actually, the way that was filmed, right? So, you know, this climax, this moment of triumph is also, a moment that one is meant to feel sad about. And I think this, to me, gets to what's great about the film, that it's always morally complex. Yeah, and you see that in the relationships. You see that in the relationships with the women, right? I think Florence Pugh is fantastic because she plays somebody who's clearly super intelligent, who's kind of obviously like sexually involved with someone who is inaccessible. There's evidently an age difference, and there are moments that are highly sexualized. They're the only moments of nudity in the film, right, where he's also nude, right? So, you know, and kind of this feeling of I'll always be there for you, but then can't be there for you, right? Like it brings up his failings that are not necessarily of his doing, you know, that are not necessarily a judgment on him, though it has the effects on her, right? I mean, you know, there's so much kind of to unpack there, right? Like so many layers of feeling, right? It's almost like a kaleidoscope of feeling because you can't blame anyone, but yet you understand the complexity of like the whole relationship. That's true of the wife. That's true of the fellow scientists who, you know, then betray him, you know, but are they doing it for the right reasons or the wrong reasons? Do they really feel like that? Does he really forgive them or not? Kind of, you know, those encounters raise all of those questions, don't they? Yeah. So it might feel like it's illustrative rather than dramatic, but actually, I think, you know, as soon as you have that moral complexity, you have drama.
Yeah, I think there is something to be said for, it was that line in Tenet that came up a lot in reviews, which was, try not to understand it, try to feel it. And I think there is something to that. I think it's a real challenge with his films to not feel like, I think I need to listen to this and I do need to understand it. So it's a little bit disingenuous to tell me to just feel it. But I did feel like in this case, I think it's useful to just let the whole thing, when I said at the beginning, I don't think I knew what was going on. I think I get the gist of it enough to follow what's happening. I just don't think I understand like sentence by sentence what's actually happening, what happened there.
Well,
but I'm with it the whole way through.
Yeah, I think that's true of everybody. I mean, in fact, my own practice is really initially to just let the film wash over you and feel it. Like kind of, you only really begin to make a different kind of sense of it by talking about it, right? And you know, and that is, to me, you know, the value of talking about it, that you begin to piece the film intellectually or formally in a way that you don't when you're watching it. Or I don't. I mean, you know, kind of, you're either in it or you're watching it, like, you know, outside it as a different kind of observer. And I think you are meant to go, you know, but also I don't think that feeling is so removed from understanding. Right? Because
films operate on feeling. I think it's interesting that Christopher Nolan in particular felt the need in Tenet to put this line in, just try to feel it, because fans of his, and I say this as I'm removed from them, and I'm not, this is what I do all the time, will analyse the logic of how the world works and how this shot works and how, you know, is there a plot hole there, that sort of thing. And you have to kind of encourage us, me, to stop doing that and to let things wash a little bit more over you. Because it is about, like, no one criticises Scorsese for his continuity errors. We let them go. We're less forgiving of someone like Christopher Nolan for that, typically, I think.
I think it's difficult. It's tricky, though, because he does build films that feel schematic. You can see how he's designed them like an architect. And I don't know whether or not it's always very successful. I don't know that you can build from absolute detailed logic to a point where it suddenly all melts into feeling. I think this is an interesting mixture of the two. I think it follows a kind of feeling logic through...
I think it's one of his most successful films because, you know, if you think of his previous films, what's the one with Leonardo DiCaprio in?
Inception.
If you think of Inception, if you think of Interstellar,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, those are films that are very difficult to understand. Yeah, that you come out of it and you think, what does it mean? How does it fit together? Like, I really felt in those films, what I interpreted you saying about this film. And I think this is one of his clearest films. Yeah, like I felt I was able to follow it all the way through in a way that I wasn't quite in Interstellar or Inception, actually.
Yeah.
Or Tenet, for that matter.
Yeah,
Like you're really struggling with, what's the
absolutely.
story, right? Like,
Particularly because you're given it's 2 hearings here. I think there are 2 primary hearings that you come back to throughout the film, and what those hearings are actually about does not become clear for a very long time. And the questions that are being asked are relevant to exactly what is being explained at the moment, but what they're overall talking about is not clear until later on. And the way that the film chooses to cut between them or cut from them to some flashback or something else is based on feeling. The feeling and the emotion and the tone and the general context is what gets us from this hearing to some related scene and back. It's not that it's explaining it in kind of pure logical or plot terms. It's cross-cutting based on tone and things like that as well.
Do you see the film as an indictment of America?
You can tell, I think, although as you were pointing out, Stephen, Nolan is half American, but he was brought up in England. You can tell the English kind of outsider look at America through it, because you do feel, I at least feel, that a pure American kind of red-blooded attitude would very much be excusing the bomb in quite clear terms, in a way that this film doesn't. It's about the feeling of guilt, and when characters say that it had to be done, or they don't even justify it in those terms so much. And actually, the reason that Oppenheimer gives for going along with it or doing it, not going along is too weak. He does it. He creates it. Is that he believes that if the bomb is dropped and people see it, it will put an end to all war. Not that it will show that we're the big I am and you can't fight us. The horror of it, I think, is the implication I get, is what will put an end to war. And he hopes that it can be a tool for peace that way. He learns far too late that that's not the case, and everyone's going to want a bomb.
Well, that's not quite what I was referring to, though. I take that point. I mean, I was referring to, the idea that, here is this quasi-genius figure who's a patriot, who devotes his whole life, to making this contribution when his country calls on him to make it. Mm-hmm. And then the government tries to bury him. Sure. Whereas you have this slick operator that's played by Robert Downey Jr., who, is, being offered one of the great posts that the nation has to give. Yeah, and who in fact is the agent, set out to sink, this, kind of very good, honest, principled person.
There's also a really key moment, I think, which is around General Groves, the Matt Damon character, which is, it's the morning after, it's the day or a couple of days after the Trinity test, and the two of them are watching these, I think it's the 2 bombs being packed up and loaded onto the back of trucks. And having worked together quite successfully up until then, what you see is the guy in the military talk to the scientist and basically say, oh, we've got it from here. Yeah. We know that it works. It's ours now. And Oppenheimer, I think, says something like, you'll keep me in the loop. And he says, I understand. I'll do my best.
Yeah, insofar as I can.
You've just watched the military-industrial complex lift from science and go, well, the gun works, we've got it. Yeah. And you leave the theoretician behind, or you leave the scientist behind who actually understands the function of the machine, and you give it to somebody that can wave it around.
In fact, I think one of the minor characters, a soldier, does literally say, we'll take it on from here.
Yeah.
So
that felt like,
you've
in a
served
very
your purpose.
graceful way, in a very gentle way, it feels like. I think that's where there's definitely an indictment on, because I think Chris Nolan thinks like a scientist, and I think he's got great respect for science and the theory.
Sure.
And I think that felt like, in a very quiet way, this is really this is the bigger betrayal in the film.
Yes.
Although it's interesting that for someone who has massive respect for science, as he clearly does, and we've seen it in his previous films, that he has, a kind of layman's understanding, but an enthusiastic layman, and he will consult with physicists, and the whole thing about interstellar and developing black hole imagery that genuinely advanced the science because no one had done it before. All that sort of thing. He's very proud of. It's interesting that this film at least nudges against the idea. I mean, it vocalizes it that there are some things we should not invent. And it's not that it's interesting. Science is never at fault. It's not that. It's that we will unleash something that we can't be trusted with. So it's not saying that science is the problem, but what it can unleash, there's no positivity to this.
Well, I mean, people are the problem as usual, and he shows how they are. There are very conflicting desires, different types of ambition. There's just like somebody misperceives a personal slight, and their whole life becomes devoted to like screwing you, right? So those are all. I mean, I think because the film brings out all these things, it's one of the reasons I think it's so great. Yeah.
I'm questioning myself actually. Did it vocalize that thought, or did I just think it?
I think when it comes up very early on, that a certain is it when he hears the story from a colleague that they've split the atom. He says, we're all thinking the same thing, a bomb. And so that, I think, is where you're exactly on the right point, which is that people are the problem. It's that that the first way we're going to think about using this is as a release of energy, as a bomb, rather than something productive, something we can use. It's something destructive.
And one of the things that they do, which I think is implicitly about ignoring that, is they if someone says bomb, someone talks over them and says gadget. That happens once or twice, and there's a poster on the wall about what are we going to do about the gadget or the long-term implications of the gadget. So it's talking about, we know this is going to be a bomb, but we're still not calling it that. We're trying to keep a remove from it because we're working on this thing. There's
perfect film to come out in the while the conversation about AI is happening.
Well, AI is
we've got to a point where we've now developed this. The question is whether or not you should. You mentioned Jeff Goldblum to me midway through the film, and you always go back to the Jeff Goldblum Jurassic Park argument of you only thought about whether or not you could, not whether or not you should.
Yeah. Although the reason I brought up Jeff Goldblum was because that's when he's chatting up Emily Blunt, and he takes her hand and he talks about how all the atoms in it are mostly empty space, but the forces give us the illusion that we're solid, and that reminded me of Jeff Goldblum taking Laura Dern's hand, talking about chaos theory, and it's like, I'm talking about science, but really I'm saying I want to fuck you. Yeah. It's like what these two films have in common, And why not?
It's a lovely moment.
Yeah.
And actually that makes me think, again, of how brilliant all the actors are, because I think Cillian Murphy is tremendous in it, and so is Robert Downey Jr. But then, we were talking about, all the other people. Some who you expect to be so idiosyncratic as to maybe, leap out of the film in a,
Rami Malek has got close.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah.
I mean, because he's wonderful in it, and he fits into the whole scheme of the film, and yet you'd expect him to be such an odd, actor that he would leap out or disrupt kind of the feel, and it doesn't. So I think that's a great credit to Nolan as well, that he manages all these such different types of actors, and it feels kind of like seamless here, really.
I think he trusts them. It feels like, because there is also a quality about his films which hasn't changed since Memento, or probably following as well, which is it kind of feels like they're run and gun a lot of the time. It feels like he trusts his actors to take the role and they'll be in the right place, and I'm sure he guides them with the direction, but they don't feel over-directed. It does feel like a lot of the time there is a camera on someone's shoulder and they're banging out scenes bit by bit.
So you were mentioning earlier, Jose, you shared on Facebook this interview. This is what you're going to talk about, which is Cillian Murphy and Christopher Nolan in a DVD library. And it's not the Criterion thing.
In Paris.
Yeah, in Paris.
Oh, yeah.
And they're looking through DVDs. And you're talking about Christopher Nolan was talking very interestingly about all these films. And he talks about collaboration with his actors and other and crew members.
Yeah.
Hugely.
I was trying to make the point with that directors are always conscious that film is a collaborative art, and they always take great care to credit the collaborators, their editors, cinematographers, costume designers. So Nolan does that throughout the film.
In a way that we don't.
In a way that critics don't, yeah. But also, what was very interesting about this video that we'll put on the blog is that one of the ways that he works through a feeling that he wants to convey in his film is he gets people to watch other films, right? So one of the films that he got his actors to watch was Amadeus. Yeah, because it is about kind of that rivalry, that conflict. There was another one which I now can't remember. But there were two films. So and he does that with his cinematographer, his set designer. Yeah, kind of. But he's got a set of films that he wants to watch with people because there are effects that he wants to kind of utilize. Yeah.
I did see an interview where he said he didn't watch Doctor Strangelove specifically because he didn't want to copy it, basically.
That's right.
You would end up doing that.
Though in this video he says, I didn't want to copy it, and yet that whole sentence sequence is...
Yeah. It's funny, the interview with him that I happened to watch was not as intelligent as the one you watched. It was this autocomplete interview with him and Robert Downey Jr., which is done for a bit more showbiz and laughs and stuff. You put into Google, Christopher Nolan, and then see what the questions people ask are. One of the questions was, does Christopher Nolan storyboard? And he said he will storyboard significant sequences, things that really need it, but for the most part, no. And I think that goes to what you were saying about working, the idea of the camera on the shoulder, let's just see what happens. Like, you'll have a setup, but you'll work with the actors, you will play through a scene and find out what the scene is.
It's very much about piecing together small moments of information. There's no long, there are no long, complicated
sequences, takes,
right, or single takes in particular. It's single pieces of information passed out to you bit by bit by bit. On this person, for this moment, for this line, on this moment where a folder's taken out of a cupboard and then put on a table.
But you see the lighting,
yes,
on especially Florence Pugh, I'm just riveted by in this film because she looks like a Tamara de Lempicka painting, and the hairstyle, the cheekbones, the way that she's lit, right? She looks so period. So, and to convey that look or to construct that image, you need to be precise. You need to be in exactly that mark, right? So, and that's not a criticism. That's just a kind of an expression of what I take his style to be, that it is, very precise.
I think it also goes back to what we were talking about just before we started recording, which is the budget for this is $100 million. And I think part of what that's paying for is impeccable production design. So that you can move around inside it with a certain amount of ease. This isn't like an old studio movie where we're going to design all of our shots very precisely ahead of time. So we shoot everything we've got and we shoot it very perfectly. I feel like they've got Los Alamos built and they can kind of move around within it with a certain level of ease because everything is as real as it could possibly look. Yeah.
Though I also want to indicate, and it's a ridiculous thing to say, but I think $100 million for a film like this is cheap. Yeah, you hear about the budgets for like some of the Avengers films, and what are they like?
Money laundering is what they are. I mean, that's why Netflix. That's why Netflix and the like are so resistant to revealing viewing figures, subscription figures, and so on, because the amount of money that goes into those is not. It's being taken. It's being kept.
Well. Yeah.
I mean, it is nothing. This must have cost. I mean, I guess you're thinking about marketing as well, but this has got to be a third to a quarter of what the Indiana Jones film cost.
Exactly. Or, you hear figures for The Flash, and that was something like $250 million or something, right? So,
where's the money going? Where's the money going?
Okay. You're building another argument. I'm trying to argue that, this is a relatively low budget to achieve what the film does, right?
Indiana Jones 5, $295 million budget. That's ridiculous. Whoa.
Unless it's worth it. You have to see the movie.
Yes, true, I've not seen it.
So this was $100 million, and you feel it's money absolutely well spent. And I'm sure they didn't pay the cast their going rate. I'm sure Matt Damon didn't make what he normally makes to be in this film. It's an incredible all-star cast, all incredibly good. Are there sequences that you found particularly remarkable or problematic?
I felt bad for Florence Pugh as an actor because it's not that her character is not very good. I mean, I agree with you when you say that she's interesting and complex and brings something really really kind of spicy to the film. They would probably be lacking otherwise. But within a minute or so of meeting her, she's got her top off in a sex scene. Second time we see her again, which turns into a sex scene that happens in front of all those guys in the hearing. And, obviously a dream sequence type of, imagined thing. But I felt really bad for her as an actress that that's what has been asked of her. And I didn't think it was justified enough that she should be topless through it, particularly, or shown.
I did.
I didn't
it justified.
I didn't feel it justified.
I found it justified because it brings in that whole sexual dimension to Oppenheimer. Yeah, without those sequences, you don't have it. And I thought it was kind of an interesting concession, or an attempt not to seem like a sexist pig anyway about it, that he is also made to take his clothes off, right?
But he's not revealed nearly as much as she is, and
Well,
that's what I found unjustified.
I think in male terms he is, in the sense that, he's filmed so that all of this is visible, right? It's not just...
You should describe what you're talking about, 'cause it's a podcast.
Yeah, of course, sorry. Yeah, you get his chest, at the side of his bum and his thighs.
Yeah, so we see him with his legs crossed.
Yeah,
so
of course.
he's hiding his modesty. But we see the
I
leg.
think in male, I think in film terms, that is the equivalent of her being topless. After all, you don't see her fully naked either. You basically, she is topless.
No, you don't. But
Yeah.
there are ways to film it. I think when you get your tits out, to put it crudely, you're competing with your body for attention.
No, you can be competing, or you can be conveying something in which that nudity is necessary. I think the film is conveying something in which that nudity is necessary. They're talking after clearly having sex.
Yeah, of course.
Right? I think, and it's an illicit affair, it's dangerous, it's kind of all of those things. It's dangerous enough so that it costs her life, right? So I think a way of generating that desire, passion, sex, without literally showing them in bed doing it, is to have those scenes.
I think it's also interesting when you get to... The two of them are naked together twice. And then, as you say, there's that really strange, really great moment where he's topless, or he's naked in front of all the guys who are effectively interrogating him. Yeah. And then she appears, but her eyeline is about her and his wife.
Mm-hmm.
So it plays with that in a really interesting way. It didn't feel like she's there naked being exposed to this interrogation. It felt like...
No, I felt more for her as an actor in that.
Yes.
That's what I felt, like her in front of a room of actors, and she's just... That's what I felt there. But I think you're just slightly misunderstanding me, Jose, about the sex scenes. It's not that I feel the sex scenes are unjustified, or that they shouldn't be shown having sex. It's that there are ways of shooting it that I think...
I know. I get you, but I think we're disagreeing, because, I think there's a way, and it's constantly evident, where you see the filmmaker's lasciviousness, right, in relation to showing a woman topless or to showing her naked, right? You're meant to ogle at her nakedness. This, it was a wide shot, it was distance. You never felt that the camera was ogling at her tits.
No,
right?
no.
So, and it conveys all these other things. I thought it was necessary, and from my understanding, Florence Pugh is somebody who would have absolutely said no if she felt it was otherwise.
No,
She's
sure.
been very vocal about that in the past. So, I didn't have...
Okay.
I mean, I felt the power of those scenes, but, I didn't feel that they were exploitative.
Fair enough.
No, I agree. I think that is... To put the camera closer, to say, basically, to cut out her nipples, because that's the thing that really makes you realise, oh, this person is absolutely fully topless on screen. It would read entirely differently. It wouldn't feel like you really are in a room with two
I don't
people
necessarily
who are
mean a
talking.
close-up. I mean a different angle or a sheet or clothing. I'm not trying to be a prude here. I'm just saying I think it detracted from those scenes that could have been equally expressive or even more expressive had they been
maybe
done slightly differently.
It's an interesting one. I think it's a discussion that's bigger than the film, though, which is about how nudity is done in films in general and how sex is done in films in general, because they so stand out when people make choices like that. When you think of there's that argument scene in Shortcuts between, I think it's Matthew Modine, isn't it? Like, to offer a connection, and Julianne Moore, and she's got this top on, and then she is completely naked from the waist down, and it's an argument between a married couple, and you cannot help but you have this, it challenges you as the viewer in that way, that you notice somebody who's naked, and you do not see women that naked in mainstream films. But
Yes.
you then have to deal with the fact that you're providing the problem because you're not used to this, and the fact that it's been done, and it is done so tastefully, means that you really feel the scale of these two people having an argument.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether or not I don't know if there's a way that you could do that in this instance where it would be quote unquote more tasteful.
I mean, personally, I think it's as tasteful as it can be. I also think we're living in a different time. You know, you watch Netflix and you're seeing tons of nudity, men and women, all completely naked from top to bottom.
Are you?
Right, yes.
What are you watching?
Yeah, we're watching.
Well, White Lotus, you know,
yeah,
to
that's
mention
true.
one, right? So, you know, I think to see a woman topless in a film also means something very different than it did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I mean, I think kind of, you know, Netflix or whatever you call that type of television, you know, has absolutely kind of resituated how we think about these things. And to me, kind of, you know, this was, I mean, I was thinking of what the scene was trying to convey, and I didn't think it was exploitative, and it's something that you're used to watching. And actually, you're used to judging often very negatively in other things, right? Because, you know, so many of the discussions in shows like White Lotus, for example, is that penis real, or is it a prosthesis? And, you know, kind of, you know, and the whole discussion becomes about the penis, like you were saying about Julianne Moore. I don't think that's the case in this film.
Okay, well, I've said what I've said, so, you know. I want to think generally about the use of IMAX footage. We've seen this in the full-on, full-frame, largest screen in the country, IMAX. The way in which Nolan is using IMAX now has developed to the point where he's using it for dialogue scenes, and it must be very, very good ADR that's being used here, because the thing about IMAX historically has been you can't use it for dialogue. The cameras are loud. You use it for spectacle, you use it for other things. And here it's being used for dialogue, not like extensive dialogue, but people are talking during it. And, you know, I was starting to pay attention to it, and the synchronization between the faces moving and the dialogue is perfect. Like, it sounds like it's been recorded on tape. And I have no idea whether they've developed it to the point where it is quiet enough to record dialogue with now. But that's how he appears to be using it. And
I mean, you can't conceive of a feature film where, you know, the dialogue becomes a problem. I mean, you know, these films have dialogue, so
yeah. But the point is have they gone? Let's record this and let's shoot this and record Luke's dialogue afterwards that plays on top. But the thing is, if they've done that, they've done it so impeccably well. I just don't have the answer to it. Right? It's interesting, but that's how they're using it now. So IMAX footage has become here. He's used it for spectacle, as everyone who's ever used IMAX has, and IMAX have their own spectacle, you know, short films that they show. And he's got closer and closer and closer to the person, to the point where here he's using it for dialogue, he's using it as portraiture, he's using it in close-up. And the close-up especially makes what you're seeing so vibrant and crisp. And you were talking about the details you can see of skin and so on.
I just think it's beautiful. And, you know, I was saying earlier that it's cinema as I remembered it in my youth, with the huge screens, and, you know, you're immersed in the crowd and the responses, you know. But what I noticed this time, it's like there's a kind of, and I don't know if this is true or if I'm just thinking, you know, but those first shots with Cillian Murphy, you know, where you're actually like almost immersed in his face. Right, and you're seeing his eyelashes, and you're seeing his stubby fingernails and his freckles and so on, and yet it has a softness that you don't get in digital. Yeah, I just thought it was, you know, it was beautiful. It was just visually beautiful to look at, and then of course the immersiveness of it was just thrilling. I thought, you know,
it makes 70mm disappoint you.
Yes,
because when it goes to IMAX, it's exactly how he describes it. It's just the best image you can possibly get.
Yeah.
But here's the other thing, is I also kind of thought that it is used so much to shoot quote-unquote normal shots, kind of basic shots, establishing shots. Like, for instance, when you walk down the sort of bank to see Einstein at the pond, the opening shot of that is in IMAX. But it doesn't stand out the way that those shots tend to do. I wonder whether it becomes so normalised that things become a little less impressive about it here. he cuts back and forth to it so much that
I found it hugely impressive.
yeah.
I mean, I loved looking at Florence Pugh and at Emily Blunt, right? And those some of those close-ups were almost painterly, right?
Mhm.
And you know, you're just kind of immersed in those images in a way that kind of recalls almost like 30s or 40s films with like the shadows and so on, but with like this depth of texture, yeah, because you're actually having color and not just shades of black or grey or white. Yeah, I thought it was beautiful.
I suppose
I can't imagine it being better, actually.
I mean, I agree. It's beautiful, but I suppose what I'm thinking is when we talk about, for instance, the sound dropping out, making a scene more intense because we've had sound so intensely throughout so much of the film until this point, it intensifies that particular scene. I wonder whether slightly more restricted use of IMAX specifically here would have intensified those moments more.
I mean, to be honest, I don't know, because I think maybe I wasn't paying attention. I mean, the scenes that I'm describing are the ones that really stood out because you think, my God, isn't IMAX beautiful? There might very well have been shots which were not shot with IMAX film, and I just wasn't paying attention. I don't know.
Well, the film switches back and forth very, very liberally, and you can always tell by looking at the aspect ratio. But you're not necessarily like. I'm not saying that's like you should be doing that. You should be just in the film, letting it, kind of direct your attention wherever. But it was something I was always conscious of, how quickly sometimes it's IMAX to 70mm to IMAX 70mm over a couple of cuts. It's sometimes quite rapid. But I don't know. It's just something that was kind of on my mind. Like some of this, I thought, wow, this shot of a pond is so meaningless because we're just getting to the scene that's going to follow, that I wish you'd kind of restrict it. It wasn't worth it right now, kind of, I thought.
I wanted the whole thing to be an IMAX.
Well,
I just think it's too good. I just feel like, why don't we just do all of it in this? It's so great. It's such a brilliant thing to see the size of that image and the unbelievable clarity of it. I think it wouldn't lose how special it is to have had the whole film be an IMAX. I mean, like, there'll be reasons why you didn't do it.
Well, I think the only reason...
But I did feel like I just want more.
The only reason not to do it is economics. That's it.
Probably.
Or probably dialogue issues. If I'm right that they haven't managed to make IMAX shooting quiet enough to shoot dialogue with, they may well have done it otherwise.
Yeah.
It'll happen one day. I wouldn't be surprised if it got to a point where he did an entire film in IMAX, and I'm fucking there for it.
He's typically the one who's leading those. What you were saying, that he had IMAX, had
you
Kodak.
had black and white IMAX in this, which had not been, that wasn't an existing medium. So
That's
Kodak
right.
developed black and white. Presumably, black and white 70mm, 65mm was a thing because there's a lot of black and white 65mm.
The black and white is one of the really clever things that only really makes sense, well, to me anyway, towards the end of the film, which is that the black and white is whenever it's Strauss's point of view on the action, right? So it's not extraneous. It's kind of like an aesthetic choice to suit not just the character, but a point of view, because you often see the character, but appearing, from Oppenheimer's story in color, right? So it's color to indicate a perspective, which I thought was brilliant.
The texture of it's different, as well as obviously the saturation, because it's this really kind of, it's like 16mm, 65mm. It's got this graininess to it that you don't tend to see in films that I've seen in recent years that are shot on 65mm. You don't see that kind of grain and that kind of, the way that the highlights bloom. It's actually a kind of grungy 65mm. All of those scenes around that banquet table with that funny little thing with the flower pot in the middle. It's got this kind of grainy quality. You really notice the IMAX black and white compared to the 65mm because it suddenly gets pin sharp. I really like that quality that the 65mm black and white has, that it feels like it's more rough in its texture than the 65mm colour does.
But the black and white is also very deliberate, because all those close-up of Robert Downey Jr.'s face, it's almost like there are no blacks in it. Like it's so white, kind of, which is an unusual way of filming.
And respect to a film that has that many people with glasses on and that like just lets them have reflections in them, and it's like there's something. No, but it's really something to give it that level of naturalism. That it's like, well, these things exist. People wear glasses, and you can see other people's reflections in them, and I like that.
Yeah. So a good question to ask is, what do you think the film loses, how much will it lose in being seen not on an IMAX screen, but on, let's say, a very, very good screen that is just not showing the full IMAX version?
I think it'll lose like 80%. No, because I think some of the things that you were saying, Stephen, about maybe, not quite getting the story and so on. I mean, imagine that on a smaller screen, because I think part of the reason why I felt I was keeping up with the story is because you're so immersed in it. You have nowhere else to look.
Yep.
Like, kind of, you are in the story, or you close your eyes, but you can't look sideways, or like, the screen is so big, and the image is so dense, right? That it just keeps you active and looking and immersed and so on. I think, if I were to watch it on a television set, I think this film would take me like 12 hours to watch, and I'd be bored, and I wouldn't know what's going on.
Yeah, you wouldn't be following
track,
it.
and yeah. So to me, like, it's it's really important, or the experience that I had is not an experience that could be reproduced by watching it on a different or smaller screen, by watching it on non-IMAX.
I think it will lose the power of the portraiture for the most part. That's the main thing I think I would miss not seeing it, because the screen is shaped for a human face at this aspect ratio, and then being able to film it at such high, effectively, resolution, though it's film, and so close up, and seeing all these details, and it's used so deliberately right at the end when we're just on Oppenheimer's face, looking at everything that his life has led to and what he's done, and it's that is not going to look the same and feel the same in a different aspiration, in a different format. That's a really special. In fact, it reminds me of what was the Barry Jenkins film?
One Night?
No,
Beale Street Could Talk.
If Beale Street Could Talk. That's the portraiture in that really struck me as well, because it's just the way. I mean, I think it's much more. There's something more humane about it in Barry Jenkins' work. You feel a kind of softness and depth to the characters that is not quite what I'm getting from it here. I suppose there's an intensity to it, and the intensity of feeling of what have I done and so on and so forth that's implicit is very strong here. But here it's the thing is in if Beale Street Could Talk, those people were beautiful, young, smooth, vibe, and here it's wrinkles. It's like the life that I've lived is on my
every little
face.
spot in Matt Damon's face.
Yeah.
It's like Come and See. The way that you look at that kid's face over the course of Come and See, and as the war takes its toll on his face, the last shot of that shot on Oppenheimer's face, it feels like looking at the kid's face at the end of Come and See, and it's everything that's happened is right there in his skin.
Yeah. I also like the use, even though I thought, this could be quite cheesy, of the background shaking. I think it's done in camera. It's not like a visual effect. The background shakes and it's during a portraiture close up on Oppenheimer, and it's more than once that the intensity of what he's feeling kind of breaks into the image essentially, and it focuses you more on him. He's the one thing in the scene that's not moving, but the background behind him is shaking. But along with the sound design as well, that's intensifying a rumble and so on. You get this very intense confrontational face. Yeah.
So, Stephen, what do you think would be lost?
I mean, I think I agree with you. I think where I found that I wasn't entirely with the film. What I think I mean by that is that I'm not listening to what they're saying.
Wow.
But I was watching it the whole time, and I'm with the music and I'm with the general sense of things. I think I just lose the definition in what they're saying, but I'm watching the whole thing. I think if and when I come to watch it at home, I will probably find that, now I can understand what is actually happening piece by piece dramatically. I understand what this person just said. But then I think I'd want to go back and watch it at the IMAX again, because now, I understand the story. Insofar as I understand what the dialogue is, but I want to go back and see it there, because, like you say, I'm looking at this amazing image, which I can't get the scale of at home, and I also can't get the scale of the sound at home. It's a really good, for someone that's been criticised a lot for his sound mixes.
Well,
this really worked.
That's why I wanted to ask you just about the sound mix. Is this talk of the dialogue a continuation of the criticism that Nolan's had of the sound mix in Tenet, in Interstellar, where people complain, I don't understand the words?
I think it is, but I don't mind. I had more of a problem with it in Tenet, but it might just be a case that was he's pushing the boat out every time, and I think it takes you a minute to catch up. I think in this one, I think you have less. I think it's a less dense sound design in terms of SFX around people's dialogue. There's a lot because Tenet's an action movie. There's a lot of people moving around and walking and cars and this kind of thing. This wasn't quite so much. This felt like there's dialogue and there's music. But there was still a lot
really
where I
important
don't really
sound
understand
effects
what
with the
people are saying.
bomb,
Yeah.
right? You know, that were used so dramatically. I think.
Actually, I wanted to think you mentioned before the Stan Brakhage-esque abstract style imagery that's all done in IMAX, and I think what's great about that is not just that it's worth it for its own sake. It looks interesting and beautiful for its own sake. These sparks and things like this that break into Oppenheimer's kind of mind, and just for a split second we see them, and then we return to wherever we are, and there's a sound effect associated with it that shocks us and whatever. But it's that also they start to become, you know, as the way this film works is nothing's explained right at the start, and we learn what things are later on in terms of like plot and story and character. That's also true of these images. They are abstract at the start, and we have a vague idea, particularly right at the start when it's like, I'm not gonna sort of wait 20 minutes to show you the bomb. We're going to start off with some bomb imagery right away. Right, here's some flames, fantastic, and then we get into the film. But it's things like when he's explaining certain physical concepts, like that scene, in fact, with Emily Blunt, where he's talking about how electrons work and how the space in the atom works. We get imagery that shows this, and it's imagery that is at the same time impressive and interesting for its own sake, but it's also actually explaining the thing. Right? And he does that. He starts to use these images. We start to understand what they're representing in physics terms as the film goes on. And I also really like the use of those two bowls. There's a bowl and a glass, and it's as they drop marbles into these things, that shows you how much uranium and plutonium, I think it was, that they've enriched for the various bombs that they're trying to. And again, that's a really, really nice, simple way of explaining to the audience, oh, I know exactly what's happening here. Once this reaches the top, we've got enough for a bomb, and we can just track it as the film goes on. Really, that's something that Nolan's actually very good at. In Interstellar, he did the thing explaining wormholes with the folded over piece of paper, and you know the question that everyone had is, why is an astronaut explaining that while they're already in space? You know, but it's for the audience, and it makes sense, and it makes it very clear how this is working. With Tenet, on the podcast we did about Tenet, I was effusive about how that red and blue room is used to explain, to show you how time reverses, because it analogizes it, if that's a word. In spatial terms, they go in one side and walk the other way out the other, and they've gone backwards. He's very good at that, I think, and that goes to his kind of his sort of layman scientist enthusiast mind.
What's good about it in this case, though, is that you're being presented with somebody who's having visions of something. He's intuited an idea, and he sees it as an image, and he has to do the work to make the science make sense to him so that he can then physicalize it. I think that's what's happening at the beginning, is it's like he can't sleep because he's having these images of something. Yeah. It's like he's learned everything he can, and he's picked up from Einstein. Like Einstein opened the door of quantum physics, and he's intuiting all of these things, but he needs to actually find a way to articulate it. And that's what you see happen over the course of the film, is you get images of, we know that it's bomb imagery, but you're looking at somebody that doesn't know what this is. He's seeing something that the world is now open to, but he needs to find out if this is a thing that really
hasn't
exists.
concretized yet. It hasn't happened yet.
I also think that opening of the film, where he's talking about his youth and his education and meeting Niels Bohr and Heisenberg and so on, that's like maybe a 20 or 30 minute montage, effectively, as we're saying, that conveys such a vivid sense of the joy of discovery and of science.
But it does much more than that, because I think also it renders knowledge international. It makes interactions with people from different cultures, different political views, so that are then brought into play at the end, right? So I think that aspect of it, of the traveling and the studying in different universities and so on, is very important.
It also brings up the Jewish question.
Yes.
So the idea that many of the scientists, most of the scientists perhaps, I don't know, numbers, but who worked on the Manhattan Project and developing the atomic bomb were Jewish, and particularly German Jews, who were pushed out by Hitler, essentially. And then the film vocalizes quite explicitly the idea that if Hitler hadn't been so virulently anti-Semitic and had not forced out these scientists, he may well have had a bomb, because they would have developed it for him, or been made to develop it for him. I'm not saying that. I think I can't remember who it is. There was a scientist, at least one, who I think stayed in Germany, was made to work on the bomb for the Nazis, and kind of did things wrong, or kept them on the wrong routes. I think the deuterium, heavy water, because it's like he knew it wasn't working, but the longer he could keep them on it, the longer he could stall them from having a bomb. I'm not saying that story's representative. I'm just saying, like, they may not have done it enthusiastically or whatever, but had they been in Germany, they would not have been in America developing the bomb for the US. They would have been in Germany developing it for Hitler. And the question of, I suppose it brings up that these scientists are Jewish. What else does it do with that, if anything? Does it talk about problems that creates, or because there's no sense of anti-Semitism in the US? They come to the US for an escape of that.
Well, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the US, and particularly in universities. And I think the film does hint at it when he gets that job, where it says, well, it's a dream job or whatever, right? Because, of course, there were, in quotation marks, but that was the term, there were Jew quotas on all of the Ivy League universities and beyond. So, to get a job like that is one thing. To kind of, give it to a Jewish person is, something else altogether, which then kind of dramatizes the urgency and so on. And I think the film does have those bits of discussions where people are not wanting to work on that project, and he gives them a moral responsibility for it, in which being Jewish is one of them. Yeah, kind of, the concentration camps, in Europe are why you need to work on this here now.
Which seemed to be, it seemed like it came up. Again, I don't hear people talking very much, but I see what's going on their faces. And I think it came up between Oppenheimer and the Josh Hartnett character. It seemed to be something that split the two of them, which was that it's as if Oppenheimer had understood the duty to work on this project based on understanding what was happening to Jews in Central Europe. And Josh Hartnett didn't seem so much on board with it. And it seemed like it felt like it had shades of, maybe it's just because the two topics came up at around the same time, but it felt like that conflict also between them was something to do with, or had shades of anti-Semitism.
Yes, I felt that too. And it's partly because of who Josh Hartnett is and what he represents, right? This kind of huge wasp, white Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, and suspicious of potentially communist links as well.
So I think the film is very good about kind of connoting all of that. Yeah. Sometimes stating explicitly, but more often just kind of connoting it, I think.
And then you cast Benny Safdie, who's one of the great Jewish writer, director, actors who's
He's lovely.
Great to see.
He's lovely in it.
Sorry, who's that?
Benny Safdie is the Hungarian one thing.
Yeah.
I want to think about Barbenheimer just a little bit in terms of box office, because this has made, according to Wikipedia's figure, 174 million so far, which is, that's an opening weekend. And Barbie, same opening weekend, 337 million is the figure. And, we've talked on the previous podcast about how these two films are activating interest in each other because of the incongruity between them. Barbenheimer has its own Wikipedia page. And it's completely, coincidental. It's a crowd thing. People have just decided that this is entertaining to them. But I think it also speaks to the idea that, we've talked before about superhero fatigue, and particularly I feel personally since that first big decade of Marvel finished with Endgame and so many characters left, and we've had to create new ones or bring in new ones, it's been much less interesting. Now, even though these are not original properties exactly, Barbie is obviously based on a toy, and this effectively is an original film, though it's based on
history.
Based on history, and specifically based on on a biography, as you said. I think the success that these two are already having points to if people are willing to go to cinema. We have a cinema packed with people wearing pink for Barbie. This, the IMAX obviously is a very special thing that people will make a particular trip to. We've come down to London for it today, and that was obviously packed out. People will go and see these. There's huge interest in. People think, oh, no one wants to go to the cinema anymore. They do, but you've got to give them something different. That's what is being offered right now.
There have to be economics or oligopolistic restrictions on the distribution of films, because otherwise it doesn't explain why a place like Cineworld, has like X amount of screens devoted to one or two films, and then they are in fact showing films from India, or sometimes from Poland, or sometimes from China, but they don't think of kind of varying their program so that there's an independent film or a foreign film, or right to actually address different audiences that are not foreign audiences, right? So I've seen Cineworld address a Polish audience or a Chinese audience or an Indian audience, people who live in Birmingham, but not actually address an art house audience, or kind of an audience that's willing to watch a drama rather than a spectacle, or different genres, or kind of they seem to devote an enormous amount of their screen time to a couple of films that they think are going to be the big ones.
But it also comes down to what I'm more trying to imply is what is being given to us. What are the biggest movies being given to us? For 10 years now, it's been superhero. 10 years or more, it's been superheroes. And right now, the two biggest movies are neither of those. They are different. And one of them is Nolan, and it's we've seen Nolan before, but his is always an event. And one of them is addressing an audience that never gets addressed in a $100 million movie, Barbie. And people are going to them.
Well,
people want to see
suppose, but we're saying the same thing, right? That there are audiences, they're just not being addressed.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
But rather than the indie, it's like if Hollywood goes, the big films, let's not do a superhero one now.
Well, but I also think, when the Cineplexes began, and I remember when they began, the whole idea was that, you now had 11 screens. But the idea wasn't that you would show Superman on 11 screens, right? It's that you would show 11 different films.
Yeah.
And some of them would be in a 20-seat cinema, and some of them would be in a 800-seat cinema, right? But that you would have 11 different films. And actually, I think that distributors have lost sight of that.
Didn't you say did you go to Argentina? Where did you go in South America, I think, that had a multiplex theatre?
Yes.
What was that?
That was in Argentina. That was in Buenos Aires, where they had one theater that was actually showing 3 plays at the same time. And, they'd be doing Hamlet, and they'd be doing a musical, and they'd be...
So they're effectively different screens. That's how the place was laid out. Is that right?
Well, there's different theaters.
Yeah, right.
And actually, there's a different type of play in each theater. That's the way you bring audiences in.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
Yeah. And actually, that's the way that multiplex theaters were designed to be. So that, you would draw different audiences to the same place, because you'd be showing different types of films aimed at different audiences. And they've just lost sight of that. So it's, they always expect the same audience, really, right? Because I don't think it's a problem with audiences. I think there are problems with audiences, right? You now have all of this audiovisual media at your fingertips at home. But, and just to go back to when we were talking about the IMAX, to me, film is an experience. Going to the movies is an experience. It's not just the story or what it means or whatever. It's actually an experience. And when you go to IMAX, you get a categorically different type of experience than if you watch it in any other way. Yeah. So to go back to the films, what would it lose? I think, it's not just what it would lose. It's actually a completely different experience. Yeah, so sometimes, like when we were talking about Dunkirk, which we also saw on IMAX, I just think people weren't talking about the same film I had seen. Kind of they were talking about it in a different way, and that's because they had seen it it was something different that they'd seen, and they had a different experience with it. Now I forget how that relates to this point about multiplexes, but
I can't remember. Just we're vaguely talking about how cinema is important, and the difference to some extent. I think you're talking about the difference between watching at home and going to cinema. And one of the things that this I think right now is disproving, or at least showing strong evidence against, is that people just want to stay at home. They don't. They want to go and see something, but give them something that they want to see.
Give them something worth seeing, because my experience of seeing things at Cineworld is, unless you pay the extra amount of money for the IMAX, you're getting worse visual quality than on your television at home.
You can
Yeah.
be, yeah. Sure.
You know, the projection doesn't have the right wattage. It always looks a bit dark and dim, right? Like in you know, you have to like pay for IMAX to get like the same kind of audiovisual quality. Well, if that's the way they're treating you, they shouldn't be surprised that people aren't going.
That's true.
The major sin I find when we go, our local cinema is a View, is that the second the film is over, they turn all the lights on.
Well, yeah.
And it's like, you're not getting us out of here any sooner because it's going to play through the whole of the credits. So maybe it's a health and safety thing. They're terrified somebody's going to trip over. But we went to see Beau is Afraid, and the credits play out over the last shot. And you couldn't see it.
Right.
Because the lights came on before directed by Ari Aster.
We've had worse experiences. We've had experiences where they forgot to turn the lights off and the film has started, right? Or we have had experiences where, you know, it's a foreign film and they have no subtitles, and, you know, 20 minutes into the film and you have to go tell them that there's no subtitles on screen. I mean,
this is the long-term creeping effect of getting rid of projectionists.
Sure.
When Avatar made everyone go digital in 2009, I think that's when this really kicked in, because it became, we can have one person running around up top, turning all the films on, and then just not bothering with anything else, and no one's trained to solve problems properly.
It's not just projectionists; it's they're getting rid of staff.
Yeah.
So you know, you go search for someone to tell them that, you know, the film isn't working or it's stopped or whatever. And you can't find anyone. And the thing is, you have an impression that there's tons of staff because they're all working the concession or the coffee place next door that isn't even owned by the cinema, right? So there's tons of people working those things, but actually very few people working the cinema itself. So it's a problem.
Yeah, and you knew somebody was up there in the projection booth today, partly because they had somebody introduce, and I forget who it was, but they mentioned by name, the projectionist will be showing you the print, the 70mm IMAX print of Oppenheimer, and it's like, good, I'm glad you...
The projectionist's name was Michael.
They said Michael?
Yeah, he introduced him, it was lovely. And it really did reassure you that, you know, you're looked after here and so on.
Yeah.
And it's also about selling, like, this particular cinema. I mean, the guy introducing it said, for one thing, you get the introduction. No one does that. And the second thing is, you're at the biggest screen in the country, you know. But there's one last thing I wanted to ask, because I don't think we've really talked about it, is the imagery of the bomb. I mean, the bomb is key, and they didn't set off a real atomic bomb, but Christopher Nolan is judicious in his avoidance of CGI wherever he can, and this was done with, I think, shitloads of TNT. What did we think of that imagery? How did it work? Was it sold? You know, did it work?
Yes, I mean, it worked for me anyway. And it was interesting because it wasn't quite the Hiroshima cloud as you see it in pictures. And actually, part of the reason it wasn't is because you see it evolving into that, right? And also, obviously, you see it in color. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, to me, that was one of the least interesting things about the film, to be honest, right? You know, because it's almost like he's got to show it to you because you expect to see it and so on. But the powerful things were, you know, when they did the experiment, or, you know, kind of the moment that the bomb is dropped and you get it all through like sound effects, right? You know, kind of those things were much more interesting to me than actually seeing
the imagery.
Yeah, but it's almost like they've got to show it because, you know, that's.
It's more about the light on them,
yeah,
rather than showing, because you've seen footage of the Trinity test, and it's like you could have put that in a shot, you could have comped that in, and it would have been fine. But it was more about this unbelievable blinding light, as if you've now been presented with something which you can't quite understand just how big this is when you set it off. And it's lovely how that's then used later on in a couple of sequences when he's being interrogated particularly cruelly by what's his name, is it Jason Clarke? When they blow the light up in the room and the interrogation carries on. I like that it was about light more than fire.
And when everyone's applauding him after they, in fact, this is important. We should talk about this. They dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and we don't get close to that. We hear it quietly on the radio that they've done it. You know, we don't get anywhere near. And that scene that you mentioned about deciding where we're going to drop the bomb, what locations we've got, is such an important scene for the film's perspective, because it's a scene about people who are completely removed from the effects of what they're doing, making this fairly casual, in fact, extremely casual decision. The guy making the decision or leading the conversation says, oh no, there aren't 12 locations, there are 11 because Kyoto, I've crossed that off because I went on my honeymoon there. I mean, that's you know, maybe that's based on truth, or maybe it's just an invention for the film, but it's a remarkable thing to consider that, you know, someone is thinking about. And so yeah, but like the actual devastation, the devastation that changes, or that invokes all of this guilt in Oppenheimer is at such a remove. But it's just the fact that he knows, the fact that he's actually seen the test. He knows, he's seen at that point the devastation of the power of this thing, that it's something we've never seen before, and then that it's confirmed that within weeks it's been used. And countless people have died, tens of thousands. That's a really remarkable use of perspective. I didn't expect it to be quiet. I didn't expect it to be, oh, and this happened, and I think that's kind of interesting.
I want to pick up on a point of Stevens where he was discussing that scene of how the light affects. Because actually, to me, when you were saying that, like, the film doesn't dramatize, to me that was an example of how the film dramatized, right? That also you see someone turning back and using the mirror. Then you see somebody in the car because they think that the shield is going to protect them. Then you see somebody wearing like face screen with the glasses, right? And this thing. There's all these different ways of protecting yourself against that light, which will work and which will not. I mean, I expected the windshield to explode or something, right? And it didn't. But that is a way of dramatizing. Yeah, that it creates this tension of like what's going to happen next, right? Like when the bomb explodes.
The one thing I just wanted to say about the imagery of the bomb, which is why I brought it up, is that for as beautiful as that imagery was, and as much as it worked, and I think there's one shot in particular where it kind of fills the screen widthways, not just vertically, which is fantastic, which is really effective. It actually made me think of the logo for, is it Troublemaker Studios, Robert Rodriguez's, and it's just like that's a logo that fills the screen with fire, and obviously it's not doing the same thing here, but it reminds me of it because it's a really kind of arresting image. This whole goes up. The thing is, because of what you mentioned, Stephen, that we know the images of the bomb, and this doesn't look very much like them, there was something a little lacking there. But what I think the scene did best was extend it in time. It took so long for this to happen. We spent so long building up to it. This countdown takes forever. And then eventually when it happens, we spend so long with the sound out and the bright light and the imagery of the flames roiling before we get the shockwave and the sound, the sonic boom. And like and so when that finally comes in, because it's going to come in because we've been shown bombs before where we see it first and hear it second. We know it's going to come in, and it takes so long to, and when it eventually does, and it is so loud, like that is where I think the power of the test is sold.
Any last comments, Ian?
Last frivolous thoughts. I thought it was lovely when you get to the end, knowing that Chris Nolan is a 2001: A Space Odyssey fan. Did you not think that old Oppenheimer looked so much like old Keir Delay at the end of 2001? I know it's probably a complete coincidence. I just thought he looks exactly like the old man beyond the infinite.
It didn't occur to me.
I just thought that was.
I was surprised there at how realistic he looked.
Yeah,
and how realistic everyone looked as old people, really.
Yeah,
maybe with the
Emily
exception of Benny
really...
Safdie. I think he didn't quite. He's so vibrant and young. But I thought that Emily Blunt looked fantastic as an old lady.
I think she was wonderful, that last unforgiving moment.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was a really great film. I'd recommend that everyone see it in as large a screen as possible.
Agreed.
Thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. I think that's all of them. Oh, and Google Podcasts. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter while it lasts. And the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you very much for listening.
Bye-bye.
Good.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. I know that.